Hello everybody, welcome to the Wonky Angle, where I talk about electronic music, both new and old. And today we're talking about album number 4 from Amon Tobin, Supermodified. Right, we were technically doing a discography review, weren't we? Got a little off track, but let's talk about the next Amon Tobin album and the last album of his to be primarily based around jazzy sample mashups. Now, I already discussed what I feel to be the guy's biggest masterpiece from this era in Permutation, but the album he followed it up with in 2000, Supermodified, I think might be his real most popular album, and the one that I suspect the most people are going to highlight as their own favorite. Certainly, if you did become a fan of Amon Tobin back in his prime, this was the album most likely to be your starting point, since tracks from this album were used in all sorts of films and commercials at the time. Toonami and Adult Swim bumps, Coke ads, car commercials, racing coverage, an anime in 2005, and the 2003 remake of The Italian Job, just to name a few placements. This album was all over the place in the early 2000s. One could almost compare this album's level of cultural penetration to something like Propellerhead's Decks and Drums and Rock and Roll 2 years prior, with a comparable amount of spy movie soundtrack type energy to match. Although Supermodified also remained under the radar enough to not get brought up in conversation quite as often as the big beat artists that surrounded it. Which I suppose stands to reason, given that A, I don't think any individual one of those ad and movie placements was as big as, like, the iPod ad or the Matrix shootout scene that Propellerheads got inserted in. And B, even though this album is often touted as a more accessible spin on the kinds of sounds Tobin explored on his previous albums, in execution, a lot of this album also ended up in even darker and grittier and more percussive territory that could even occasionally feel slightly more experimental than the last album. While the album is obviously far from lacking in hooks, and its greater, not really mainstream success does make perfect sense to me, it's no more pop-friendly by my ears than Permutation was. Which makes it all the easier for its biggest fans to really go to bat for it as one of his biggest masterpieces, and talk about it as if it is some kind of underlooked classic nobody knows about, even when songs were played in commercial spots right under lots of people's noses. The fact that a record like this could reach the level of success it did at all is a testament to something. Now, as for my own experience with the album, I was obviously still too young when the album was at its heights of popularity to be able to remember it. For all I know, songs from this album could have been playing in commercials I saw when I was a kid, but I wouldn't have remembered or recognized it. As I've mentioned in other videos, I marathoned all his albums like around the same time in my freshman year of college, I think. I don't remember exactly what my initial reaction to all his albums were on my very first listens of them, but I do remember this was in just as heavy rotation for me back in the day as Permutation was. I was listening to this one all the time, and I also remember overplaying it and getting sick of it to the point where I stopped being able to get as much out of it as I did initially. Which didn't really happen in the same way with Permutation. That album I also overplayed back then, but it also had like a lot more longevity past my early college days, where Supermodified was an album that I started out super hot on, and then I kinda systematically mined all the enjoyment I could out of it until there wasn't all that much left. And I also kind of feel like something kind of similar happened with while I was listening to this in preparation for making this video. I hadn't listened to it in full 4 years, and on first return visit, I was more hyped on it than I remembered being and was ready to say, yeah, you know what, maybe I just went about it the wrong way when I was younger. This album is still great, and I kept listening to it. And once again, some of the luster started to go away. I was questioning myself on it again. I think where I have to land on this album is that I think it's very good. I think it still exemplifies the kind of sound that only Amon Tobin was doing at the time, and is a really unique blend of sounds that you can't get in quite the same way out of any other album, including other Amon Tobin albums. It has a specific sound to it that you don't get out of Permutation or any of his subsequent albums. But I don't think I properly love it on the same level that most people do. It's certainly very cool and flashy on the surface with lots of elements that feel really clever and ear-catching, but Permutation felt like it was setting up some kind of musical world I could get myself immersed in, and I weirdly don't feel like Supermodified goes nearly as deep for me. It's kind of a mixed bag with lots of high points and other tracks that maybe seem interesting at first, but maybe kind of wear out on me the longer I sit with, or just kind of bounce off me and aren't really that fun for me to get through sometimes. It has like a super alluring and interesting exterior, but if I spend too much time with it, I start feeling like a strange hollowness out of it, like experimental musical junk food. I think I've ended up developing a similar relationship with this album that I do with, like, the music of Pretty Lights. Not to quite as pronounced an extent, since Pretty Lights will always be inextricably tied to, like, one very specific span of time in my adolescence that has, like, a lot of very weird, complicated feelings tied up in it. But it's similarly the kind of thing which I was, like, near obsessed with at one point in my life, and I don't feel like I get the same spark I used to out of it nowadays. And what really bites about this album as well is the fact that, just like Bricolage, there was another track on this album which had to be removed from all digital and streaming services, presumably due to sample clearance issues, leaving piracy and used CD copies as the only way for people to hear said track nowadays. Now, with Bricolage, even if Easy Muffin is one of my favorite tracks on that album, I don't think the removal of that track makes for as impactful a change as it could have been. The flow of the album was still maintained, and it wasn't such a massive highlight that its removal, like, fundamentally shifted my feelings on the way the album came together as a whole. But on Supermodified, the track that had to be removed was 4-Ton Mantis, which happens to be my favorite track on the album by a country mile. This track starts out in similar territory to the kind of vibe you'd get out of his last album, with all these swirling, jazzy soundtrack samples and mysterious pads adding up to that film noirish vibe. But then a pattern of these stomping piano chords comes slamming down. Dun, dun, dun. There's like a quirky fiber slap sound in the middle of that loop too. And then this absolutely massive mix-filling hip-hop breakbeat comes crashing down on top of it, and then it pays off into a drop so satisfying it rivals something you'd hear out of, like, the Chemical Brothers. Also, weirdly enough, this is one of the few moments on the album that I like way more nowadays than I did when I was younger. Back in the day, I tended to be drawn to the album's slower moments over the album's heavier banger moments like this, but there is just, like, such a carefully planned tightness and catchiness to this track that very few other Amon Tobin tracks have in the same way. And that's not just on the merit of the hook he happened to sample. It's more in the way that, like, the build-up and payoff is executed. I kind of don't think I'm going to be making, like, a top 10 tracks video for Tobin, because top 10 tracks videos are both too much of a copyright risk these days and don't attract enough attention to be worth the effort like they used to be. But 4-Ton Mantis absolutely would be on that list somewhere, easily in my top 5 favorite tracks from him. Probably top 3, honestly. And what's really sad is that as the album's catchiest and most attention-grabbing moment by such a distance, taking it out does way more damage to my enjoyment of the album as a whole than taking out Easy Muffin. This removal is like if Moby's Play cut out the track Porcelain, or if the Chemical Brothers Surrender cut out Hey Boy, Hey Girl. I mean, it technically wouldn't ruin the albums, those obviously are not the only good tracks on those albums, but you would be missing arguably their most iconic moments, and something crucial to the experience would be lost. I will be scoring this album at the end as if it still had 4-Ton Mantis on it, but if I had to score the version of the album currently on streaming services, I feel like it would be like a half point lower. That's a big loss. Copyright law sucks, man. But anyway, the rest of that album outside of that is still quite good. I just, find it to be kind of uneven. The opening track, Get Your Snack On, is actually kind of like an emblematic microcosm of my weird conflicted feelings with the album as a whole. On its surface, it's also a pretty exciting and attention-grabbing mix with all these burbling synth riffs paying off into big crashing break beats, energetic bass lines, 60s psych rock organs, funk guitar licks, saxophones and trumpets, even little like one new flute riffs cut in every now and then. It's really hype, but also like the lead synth or electric piano line that the track is primarily built around. I don't know, that makes for a pretty weak hook. I can remember the tune to it, mostly out of sheer amount of times I've played this album over the years, but it's, kind of oily and indistinct, and the whole track, as hard as it goes, can also feel, like, misshapen and a little incoherent. Like all these elements are, like, being just barely held together with scotch tape and stuff. It's a cut that I really like when I first jump into the album, and maybe kind of starts to shrink on me the more time I spend with it, and feels like all these elements don't quite fit together as seamlessly as they could. A good track, but not a home run. Honestly, it feels more like an overture or album intro to lead into 4-Ton Mantis acting as the real opener. Good to set the general tone of what the album's about, but, not a major highlight for me. Most of my favorite tracks on the album, I'll admit, still tended to be tracks that, stuck to simpler and comparatively more mellow arrangements, since those tended to be the moments where the hooks got the most space to really hit and stick in your mind. See a track like Slowly, combining psychedelic western-flavored guitars with looping, fluttering string samples and a few cut-up sax solos. Or the similar mix of low-key guitar loops imitating keyboards on Chocolate Lovely. The latter also gets plenty of space to progress and really build up more like crisp jazzy breaks and dramatic suspenseful string sections. And I have very similar feelings on that track as I do on the track Dio. The guitar samples on that track have more fast-paced, moody strumming, but they still make for a memorable enough hook, and the way they build into lots of bubbling off-kilter bass synths and eventual crashing and shuffling breakbeat workouts is once again the kind of mix that you are only going to get from Amon Tobin. I also, of course, have to really highlight the album's ending, since back when I was in college, the tracks from this album that got the most play for me by far was not 4-Ton Mantis, but rather the last two tracks. Especially the penultimate cut, Keepin' It Steel, the Anvil track. The off-kilter sample loops of guitars and xylophones occasionally broken up by two chords of horn sections. I mean, it sounds like it's in some kind of odd time signature, but it's really just a normal group of 8 beats that happens to be subdivided into like a group of 3-3-2. That sounded so freaking cool to me back then. Even though there's barely anything to the track outside of that core loop, besides maybe a little bit of swirling strings here and there and the pinging metal noises that are present throughout. As dead simple as it may be, just the way it got cut together and the texture of the core sample itself felt so striking and interesting and unique. Now, the fact that the track is so simplistic, I suspect was part of why it also got kinda hurt by personal overplay back then. It's no longer like my favorite track here overall, but it is still a favorite. And now I think I might slightly prefer the track that immediately comes after it, the album closer, Natureland. The album's most chill moment of them all, just lots of classy, fluttering pianos and clarinets and stuff going over a simple, repeating, laid-back sample groove adding up to all those classic film noir mystery movie vibes, really providing a mix you can really immerse yourself in, like much of the stuff that showed up in Permutation. You can just smell the cigarette smoke and envision the poorly lit private detective's office filmed in black and white with that one. That is some good shit. Now, all of this material has held up well. The moments where I found myself struggling a bit more on average has been like the more experimental and percussion-heavy cuts. Yeah, I know how cliche that sounds coming from me in particular, but that's nothing to do with how strange or experimental any of the remaining cuts are. Like, there's nothing really that off-putting about these kinds of tracks, and as we'll find out as we go later in Tobin's catalog, he does have the capability to go a heck of a lot more out there than anything that appears on this album. But there are still some tracks that focus much more on, like, the jazzy percussion workouts, and oddly end up, like, kind of blending into the background for me more than anything. The track Saboteur is one example. That track tries to form a hook out of, like, a sparse mix of these kind of clanking percussion sounds and off-kilter upright bass loops with all these intense stabs of bass in various shapes and sizes blasting through periodically. It's cool, but also a little on the sparser side, feels like a less interesting take on other ideas the album's done better elsewhere. If I'm not in the right mood, that one can get a little repetitive and start to lose me. I'm also a little conflicted on a track like Golfer vs. Boxer, which, to be absolutely clear, is still a really cool track and closer to being a highlight. I mean, it's possibly the album's loudest and most intense moment of all, a roller coaster ride of off-kilter choir samples, shuffling drum solos chopped up into oblivion, pummeling and tunneling bass. It's aiming to feel like pure chaos and succeeds at exactly what it's going for. But also none of these sounds feel like they have much structure to tie themselves together, and it can feel kinda aimless. That, along with the distinct lack of a hook, makes what should be a big highlight for me and will undoubtedly be one of the very best tracks for other people, ends up being a track that on some listens I don't even notice is playing at all and just kind of blends into its surrounding tracks. It's really cool if I sit up and pay attention to it, but if I'm not making that active effort, it's not as likely to grab me on its own. And it maybe seems a little worrying that what should be one of the album's biggest climaxes just kind of like bounces off me more often than not. Although I do suspect part of why that track doesn't stick out to me as much is the fact that it comes immediately after the track Marine Machines, which delivers a similarly chaotic and all-over-the-place mix that I think comes together in a way that I find much more effective and memorable. Building from low-key movie soundtrack orchestral samples into squirting percussive synth effects and more chaotic brass section samples and thicker percussion mixes that have a lot of heavy and stomping but strange and off-kilter presence to them. The track may also feel like a cavalcade of layered random sound effects sometimes, but it feels like it's given like a little more of a structure with that like initial clarinet or oboe sample in the beginning acting as an effective enough hook to tie all of it together. I can mark that track as an actual highlight. It's probably my personal favorite out of the album's more out there experimental moments. So yeah, I mean, I may not have as strong feelings on some of these tracks as I want to, but again, most of them are still cool, and I can get into them with the right mood and setting. There are, however, unfortunately, 2 remaining tracks which I don't really like that much, and on most listens I might be feeling more of an urge to skip. One of those is Precursor. This track, I initially thought the novelty of it being primarily based around lots of high-speed beatboxing, care of guest performer Quadriceptor, was interesting, and the off-kilter guitar loops and drilling drum and bass style whirring synth effects make the mix more hype. But also the track doesn't really progress much beyond its initial idea, and the more times I listen to it, the more like the wetness of all the mouth sounds being made starts to get more annoying and grate on my nerves, rather than interest me. So yeah, not really crazy about that one, but I mean even that track I have had listens where I could still mess with it, which is unfortunately not something I can really say about Rhino Jockey. The weakest track here by some distance, and one that's just never done much for me at any point in time. The mix of elements from buzzing bass to shuffling breaks to even light woodwinds feels like it should be exciting and propulsive, but the balance of all these elements is so off as to turn everything into like an unpleasant and monotonous sludge. The drums barely have any momentum, there's no groove, and the track doesn't bang at all. The bass swallows everything up, but not really in a satisfying way. There's no tune or hook to speak of, and there's not really much in the way of progression either, even though this is also the album's longest track at 7.5 minutes. It feels like the musical equivalent of trudging waist deep through a thick, muddy swamp while it's also pouring rain, which I suppose could be part of the appeal for some people. I mean, to be fair, despite what it sounds like, I don't hate this track either or find it to be, like, so unpleasant to be an active distraction from the album. There are many listens I've had where it just blends to the background, becomes one with the surrounding vibe, and I don't really notice it. But unlike Golfer vs. Boxer, which gets a lot better when I sit up and pay attention to it, the listens of Rhino Jockey, where I'm not paying as close attention to it, tend to be the more preferable ones. If I am paying closer attention, this is just kind of like a dull, unkempt mood killer, and it kind of tanks the pacing for a bit too. So yeah, I guess that's everything on Supermodified. I don't want to make it sound like I'm being like too harsh on this project, since I do see exactly why it's viewed to be such a massive classic. I still love many individual moments on it, even if you put aside the best one that got cut out. And even my least favorite moments here, I can see how they could be favorites for other people. Like, as much as I don't really enjoy Rhino Jockey, I still think the mix of sounds is unique enough to allow me to respect it more than, say, much of the meandering Amen break workouts that took up much of the entire second half of Bricolage. And I think the album is very well sequenced, too. I think all these tracks are put in just the right order for them to be able to hit with the most effectiveness, as well as make the album feel like it comes together as a cohesive whole with an extremely loose narrative arc. And again, the line Tobin walks with this project of both being really out there experimental sometimes, but also accessible, where one could make comparisons to, say, Chiastic Slide era Oudiker, as well as the Propeller Heads, and have both of those parallels kind of make sense, That has to be commended. You cannot fault the guy for finding the level of success he did, operating purely on his own terms and doing it in such a specific way that no one else would. But it's also an album that I've often really wanted to go in and get like a masterpiece level experience out of, and maybe I did for a while when I was in college, but nowadays I just find it to be a very good but not quite great, kinda all over the place mixed bag with some amazing tracks that get me super hype or immersed in them, taking up space next to other moments that I don't really feel that strongly about. It feels more like a transitional effort for him, like he was taking the sound he perfected on Permutation into new territory, showing some new ambitions and desires to be different and go against the grain and stuff. But I feel like he would be able to further refine these ambitions into something much more impressive for his next outing. At this point, these ideas weren't quite fully formed yet, and the actual execution of them could, be a bit hit and miss for me sometimes. I would not at all be surprised if this turns out to be like a lunatic harness type situation, and most of the comments will be talking about how this is people's absolute favorite work from Tobin and how it changed their life and stuff, and I do absolutely get where those people are coming from. I just think it's merely a very good album, and more one of his middle tier works, not one of his very best, so yeah, I'm overall feeling a 7.7 out of 10 on it. But of course, this is just my opinion. You can feel free to disagree with it, but I'd like to hear your thoughts, so leave the comments in the comment thing down there. Shout out to my Patreon supporters, they're awesome people. You want to add yourself to that list, link to my Patreon is in the description. But yeah, that's pretty much it. That's all for today. See you next time.